Welcome to Off Baseline. I'm Nate Staley. Today I'll be speaking with Leslie Dorrough Smith on her book Chaos Rhetoric, Sex, Speech, and the Politics of Concerned Women for America. And in what will follow, a discussion of how rhetoric, religious, political, nationalist, etc., impacts our societal and political imagination, how it frames the dialogue. So it was a really enjoyable conversation, and you would be better for listening to it. Trust me on this one. All right, without further ado, my interview with Leslie Dorrough Smith.
Just a little bit about the book, and I'd like to maybe sort of tie a thread between sort of what the areas you cover in your book to now, because I feel like we can very easily do that.
Yeah.
It flows pretty well. So, maybe sort of go ahead and define our terms, because the book talks a lot about chaos rhetoric.
Right.
So what is chaos rhetoric?
What is that thing? Yeah.
What is that thing?
So let me say first what I think chaos rhetoric is not.
Okay.
to just sort of address what some, not so much critics, but some general critiques of the idea
right.
argued. I do say in the book that chaos rhetoric is a way of talking, right?
Yeah.
And it's a way of talking that is intended to elicit a certain effect on a large group of people.
Okay.
I do emphasize that chaos rhetoric is a type of declension speech that's intended really to invoke fear, kind of a sense of, it's all going to hell in a handbasket, to really invoke a sense of fright and panic and mm-hmm. An impending looming chaos, and thus the name, right? To describe some sort of political or social situation that's on the landscape. What it's not, though, is just simply fear speech or a fear tactic. And I want to point that out because I think it would be really easy to read the way that I describe chaos rhetoric and say, yeah, of course, everyone who wants to persuade anyone will use a fear tactic in order to get things done. Right. And this is true. I mean, it works super well. I think I mentioned this in the book, but I mention it a lot in class when I'm teaching my students. As a parent, I use fear tactics constantly, even though I consider myself a reasonably competent parent, right? There's still a lot of, if you don't do this, this is going to happen. You don't want that to happen, right?
Right. There's some things you should be afraid of.
Exactly. Right. Exactly. So chaos rhetoric, though, is a little bit different. It's the way that I'm approaching it is that it's much more than just a fear tactic, in the sense that I'm trying to look at the much larger picture of what a group argues at one point in time as far as its own platforms and its own identity, and what it says in terms of fear tactics along the way so that its identity changes. And what I mean by that is that the heart of chaos rhetoric is the way that it hides or makes invisible the seams of social change. So at one point in time, obviously I was looking at Concerned Women for America in this book, which I happen to have right here.
There it is.
Concerned Women for America part.
A little to the right, or to your left. There we go. We got the full frame.
Ooh, okay, good. All groups use it. It's not an unusual tactic, but it's particularly tricky for groups like evangelical groups that claim some sort of eternality, some sort of absolutist position that, when you claim to be inspired by an unchanging deity, it's hard later to change. And that's really what I wanted to focus on, is that chaos rhetoric is a way that groups that need to change over time, but that need to conceal their changes, that such groups can make those changes without appearing to have done so.
Right, which would make it less effective in the process.
Right. So that, to me, is why we can talk about chaos rhetoric, yes, as a type of declension speech. Yes, it is the combination of, I mentioned emotion, and, you had also mentioned emotion and myth and persuasion, right? Yes, it's using a heightened, usually negative emotional state, and evoking that state by telling a very narrow slice of reality, and sharing that reality and the negative emotions that it's likely to evoke in order to get a certain outcome. But again, that if you only stop there, or if you stop there, we're still in the fear tactic realm. But the reason why groups like CWA use it so effectively, and we find this again with a lot of other, conservative religious groups in general across the globe, is that they have to grapple with the fact that they must change to remain alive, from a basic sociological sense. But they can't at the same time admit to those changes, or else they go back on their so-called eternal platforms. So if I never have to, and I'm now speaking kind of as CWA, but if I never have, if I can manage to get political support for, let's say, conservative politics in the U.S. in general, and CWA pretty much toes the party line when it comes to party politics. They're very pro-Republican in almost every way. So there's no nuance there.
Very, very aligned.
Yeah, exactly. If I need to, if I know that my positions are going to have to change, or if I know that I'm going to have to respond to a shifting audience, and that's part of being a good, communicator too, right? What you learn in your first, speech class is to, read your audience. This is it, right?
Right.
If your audience changes, then your message has to change. And so the point that I try to make in that book is that for groups such as that have a lot at stake in these eternality claims, it's usually far more effective for them to talk much more about what you should be scared about than what they actually stand for. Because the boogeyman can always shift easily, and no one will question that. But if you can very incrementally realign your own position so that it's much more seamlessly and subtly shifted, then it's quite a lot easier. You can move the boogeyman anywhere on the spectrum you need to move it. And keep that rhetoric going, all the while sort of, making your own seams and shifts invisible.
Right, which kind of makes me for me, it begs the question about is chaos rhetoric, and you mentioned this before, that anyone uses sort of this type of rhetoric.
Right.
But is there some sort of a specific appeal to, say, ideologies that tend to operate more based on fear? I mean, sometimes it's hard to define, say, fascism or nationalism or things like that. But when people try to there's typically something in there about provoking fear, getting people in that, if we want to use these terms, a fight or flight response, to where you don't sort of use that frontal lobe and sort of cognitively determine like what a reasonable step would be. Maybe speak more to that if you could.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess if you think about it, the social groups that are defined more by fear also are, I mean, just in very basic terms, they tend to be more fundamentalist. And by fundamentalist, I mean, they tend to be much more dichotomously oriented, right? The world is black and white. You're for us or against us. In other words, they're missing subtlety. They're missing nuance. So I think we could make the argument that no matter whether we're talking about a religious group or not, or, no matter whether we're talking about a political group or not, any group that adheres to a very rigid kind of fundamentalist black and white perspective is almost by definition invoking some of the same sort of absolutes that religious groups like CWA invokes. So it seems to me that, and I'm sure that there could be some exceptions to this. So I'm not saying this is true across the board, but it seems to me that the groups that often do the best with fear are the groups that are most rigid in saying, this is never okay, things such and such. And, there are some cases when this fear is completely warranted, like, child abuse is never okay. Okay, great. We can all sign on to that.
We can all use emotion to, shame.
And we should, right? And, and according to many scholars, this is one of the reasons we have emotions is, as they do serve some sort of protective function.
Yeah.
But at the the same time, when we're talking about much more shades of gray, controversial, politically inspired, the social fights that go on, and we see those fear tactics emerge really strongly, they tend to emerge among those that, again, do tend to have this much more black and white perspective on the world. And the way that you persuade people to adopt black and white perspectives in the first place is you scare them.
Yeah.
So, to be super simple about it, I'm telling my students all the time, many, many, many things in the world are shades of gray. In fact, the vast majority of things in the world are, fall into the shades of gray category. This becomes completely visible whenever I'm teaching a class like ethics.
Oh.
Where, everyone thinks that this is always wrong and that is always right. And then we come up with 17 caveats for the this is always wrong category. Right. And then everyone's, their hands are, they're wringing their hands and they're all upset. So this is how it works, right? If you need to tell a group of people that they need to conform in very rigid, this is right, this is wrong ways, if we're going, gung ho for that dichotomous worldview, then fear does seem to be the absolute best way to get the job done.
Oh yeah, and it's super effective.
Yeah, right.
Right. It's just from the perspective of what can provoke fear. And even when I think about de-escalation sort of in my professional practice, I try to activate that frontal lobe, that left brain thought that, just maybe get to talking about something instead of getting out of that state. But if you want people to have a visceral reaction and there's an issue that you want people to focus on that is predominantly works in visceral reactions, then you have to elicit that. So, so it's super helpful to sort of understand what you're doing if you want to build some sort of movement. Yeah, exactly.
And, to perhaps foreshadow something we're going to talk about in a bit.
Right.
We know that people respond far better to emotions than, I hate this. I hate to make this dichotomy itself, but to emotions than facts. So I could spend all day long trying to convince you of something, and if you're not emotionally on board, you're not emotionally on board.
Right.
And so, in terms of bang for your buck, people whose job it is to professionally persuade the public, have no reason not to use fear in terms of, in terms of thinking about excellent marketing strategies.
Right.
It might not be the most ethical thing around, but it works.
But yeah, ethics are not in a list of priorities for trying to meet your political, especially your political goals. Ethics are not high up on the list. Ethics might be a part of the communication or how you present yourself.
Right.
Like you might say, "Oh, I'm for ethics reform," when really that's part of a strategy for messaging. So.
Right.
And so as we sort of get into the political realm, I kind of think of sort of where, you start a little bit earlier in the book, but I do want to start sort of with Reagan using chaos rhetoric and sort of what you used as an example. He talked about the family, and he used strictly defined in sort of the heteronormative nuclear form as the family as the savior of social ills. And he contrasted that with the welfare queen, the living lavishly on food stamps and health insurance, and did a tie-in with sexual immorality, and so that's kind of where you create that visceral response, or in a couple areas where you do that. But yeah, so speak a bit to sort of what you found with that. Anything surprising, or?
Do you mean in terms of surprising that Reagan uses that, surprising that it continues today, surprising what aspect of Reagan?
Well, I guess it's not surprising that that tactic would be used, or since PR campaigns since, probably near the beginning of the century and beyond have used sort of that. But was the family as a structure or as a tool of rhetoric, was that something authentic to the Reagan administration?
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So interestingly enough, I had totally forgotten until you said this right now. I talk about Reagan and the family imagery in my new book, and I forgot that I used it in this book.
There's a new book.
Obviously, it's not the same thing, but actually, some of the research for my new book, I was looking specifically into the historical context in which that's used. So I'm glad you asked.
Yeah, right. And we'll plug later, but this is a great transition.
Happy to. So scholars who look at the 1970s and kind of America in the 1970s and the state of a lot of the political rhetoric at that time, do mention that there was lots and lots of family commentary going on at that point. There were lots of reasons for that. A major reason is that, we're talking about the Vietnam War, and we're talking about predominantly fathers and sons, hundreds of thousands of them, being, called away, drafted, killed. And by the time it's all said and done, we're talking about a substantial number of American men who are physically or mentally, in many cases, maimed by their experiences. And we're talking about, as a result, in kind of a more practical economic sense, we're talking about a pretty substantial realignment of that, kind of nuclear heteronormative, dad is the breadwinner, I don't know what the connection is between bringing home bacon and winning bread, but I've always totally wondered, what's the bacon bread connection? So,
well, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, me neither.
Bacon is super tough, I guess.
Yeah, gotcha. So anyway, but when you have, a substantial proportion of your young men gone, and when you have, a lot of American men who, hinged their identity to a great degree on being, again, the breadwinner, and these people are gone. We've at the same time, what this means is that women are needing to pick up many of those roles that previously they might not have, have been doing. On top of that, the feminist movement really begins to get politically active in the late 1960s. And so across the 1970s, we're talking, in addition, about large groups of, political activists who are beginning to speak really forthrightly about some pretty substantial gender inequalities. You add to that the fact that in the previous couple of decades, we had a number of major pieces of civil rights legislation that are attempting to level the playing field regarding race in the U.S. It's one thing after another. Yeah. And I mention all of those things because while they might independently seem like they don't add up to much of anything, when the white heteronormative family is the one that, in your mind, whoever you are, in your mind represents the American ideal, it's not too hard to figure out that, when some families are literally collapsing through, the death of a son in Vietnam, and other families are wildly reorganizing because, the daughter, has heard this feminist message, and now the neighbors down the street who we don't talk about because they're Black, now they have equal access to this and that. It seems like the world is shifting. And so, in some ways the world was, that makes a lot of sense.
It was a busy time.
The family, as I write in Righteous Rhetoric, the family is probably the best fear tactic you can use. It's super, super available. And by that, I mean that most everyone feels a connection to the word family in some way. It's relatively infrequent that you have a person who has absolutely no family at all, or that you find someone who has no emotional ties to the concept, right? So
or history or anything.
Exactly,
like that,
right. So even if there are no living family members that this hypothetical person might have, they still are invested in the notion of family, and so it's one of the most ubiquitous positive symbols around. Yeah. There's no one who's going to say, I'm against family values.
I'm against family values, right?
No one will say that. Even if we can agree that what they mean by family values might be this extremely narrow, self-serving, even if I may say unethical perspective, no one's going to say those words, right?
Right.
So
just my family values, right?
Exactly, right. So what Reagan did really masterfully was he took the tensions of a bunch of white conservatives, and he knit them together into a story about the decline of the family. Mm-hmm. And he laid the blame for the decline of the family on welfare queens and on people who, in retrospect, I know there are some conservatives who have said, yeah, that probably wasn't the most fair metaphor that Reagan used, the welfare queen. And yeah, we know that, the example that he brought up was referring to one woman who was managing to sort of build the system, and that she was not at all indicative of the 99.9% of the way that
right.
people on welfare were being treated. So is this the sort of political advantage that politicians use all the time? Yes, I get it, right? On the other hand, what ended up happening there was that he codified a symbol that brought lots and lots of people together. And we still hear tons of anti-poverty. Welfare isn't around in the form that it used to be, but basically anti-welfare rhetoric that there's no doubt that Reagan fueled with a lot of those speeches on the family. Right. And of course, the family he had in mind, I think we all know, the family was the white heteronormative middle class and higher family.
Right. I mean, simultaneously, while this is all going on, there's the AIDS epidemic that that's being sort of completely ignored.
Right. Yeah.
And there may be families in that sense that are falling apart, is not part of the concern.
Oh yeah. No, exactly. And this is kind of like with George W. Bush. If you were a conservative Christian, you knew what to hear in Reagan's words, right? Mm. Reagan dropped a lot of conservative Christian imagery in his speeches. And again, not to get biblical, but those who had ears could hear, right? And so
it is Sunday.
Yeah, it is. Oh yeah. It's Palm Sunday at that.
It's Palm Sunday. I should have brought my palm back.
So, I think, those who knew what he was talking about knew what he was talking about. And they were able to pick up on those nuances, and they were able to not only resonate with the positive associations they might have between religion and nation and ethics, but, this perennial sense, and all generations in the U.S. have done this, but this perennial sense that everything is going to hell, and the kids these days, and I always love it when historians, occasionally you'll run across a book a really well-recognized book every decade or so, where you have a new historian or someone like this who will write about the chaos rhetoric that every generation has used to talk about the one prior to it. Mm-hmm. So there is literally no generation of American citizens who have not said, oh, our nation is about to crumble if it weren't for those kids.
Those new people. Yeah.
Right.
The millennials. Yeah.
Yeah. The millennials. Right. and they're zombies too.
Watch out.
And they want it. Right. So I think once you get a sense for what that rhetoric looks like, and once you see that it's relatively ubiquitous, and once you also see that it's used in very specific situations to get a job done. Right. And this is another thing I tell my students all the time. This is never about, I'm so worried about a vague sense of demise, right? This is always, I'm using this rhetoric, when it's coming out of political mouths, I should say. I'm using this rhetoric because I want a very specific thing to happen. And this rhetoric is the tool I'm using to get that job done. Yeah.
And it's super effective, as you point out. Right. As you highlighted. And, and so we get that, just again, the Reagan era resurgence of, resurgence, but like, maybe renaissance is a better word, of moral majorityism of, and then out of that comes the group that you talk a lot about, the CWA, the Concerned Women for America. And, they define themselves as true feminism, kind of in a response to the 60s wave of feminism. And from my vantage point, it's fairly obvious that it's basically reactionary politics and patriarchal structure with the cover of consenting groups of women. Which is a side note. That's one of my favorite avenues to go to in a political discussion is, I'm Jewish Jewish, so I can't be anti-Semitic. I dated a black person, so I can't be racist.
Right.
That kind of sort of token representation is a fun little rabbit trail that we get off, that we find ourselves on a lot. But Chaos Rhetoric basically allowed for this group to project itself into the American consciousness, like you point out, and as a cultural force. So is that a fair assessment, first of all, of CWA? And could you speak a bit to maybe how they used that rhetoric?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I talk in Righteous Rhetoric, and I also will talk in Compromising Positions, which is the new book, about how evangelical types of rhetoric, even amongst people who are not evangelicals, are still pretty powerful. So if you are an American and you have had the sort of media exposure, and when I say if you are an American, I'm not here talking about any sort of legal status. I simply mean if you've been here for a bit and you've soaked up some of this culture, it's hard not to have soaked up some evangelical narrative along the way. Some folks might say, well, this doesn't make much sense because even though there are lots of evangelicals in the U.S., they are by no means the majority. No, I mean, this is correct. They are by no means the majority, but they are politically very, very loud. Right. And so I like to point out that even ideas, ideas that abortion is problematic, ideas that same-sex marriage is problematic, ideas that sex before marriage is, any of these things that most Americans will agree could be morally problematic, are centered on much of the rhetoric for which Christian right groups are responsible and have really been, loudly promoting since the 1960s and 70s. Right. Now, that doesn't mean that evangelical groups are the only groups to talk about that. Of course not, right? No. But it does mean from a political perspective, it's very difficult to find a group that's been stronger than the Christian right in moving those issues to the forefront. So that's kind of how I look at it, is they might not be the only ones saying it. Right.
In America.
Right. They're not the only ones saying it, but they are certainly the loudest and usually best funded ones saying it.
Best funded, most referenced.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. So this sense then that, and I talk about this in the new book, this sense that we can all be sort of thinking like an evangelical, even if we're not one, right? Is something that I take really seriously, to the point that in the new book, I even hesitate to talk about, and I know I'm foreshadowing the new book, like spoiler alert, right?
Love it. No, do it.
But okay, let me say this very fast thing so that this makes sense. The new book is called Compromising Positions, the subtitle always stumps me.
Still being written.
Yeah, no, it's done. It just got decided though. Is it Sex Scandals, Politics, and American Christianity? Yeah, that's it. I think, or something super close to those words. Yeah, almost those words. Right. Excuse me. I'll just call it Compromising Positions because I remember that part.
Right. Got to look it up on Amazon to find out for sure, guys.
Right. Tell me about it.
Or somewhere else.
Right. So, in that book, I really get away from talking about evangelicals as a discrete group. And I instead try to talk about evangelical rhetoric as something that many Americans, regardless of any religious affiliation they do or do not have, that they share it. Right. So I like to think, and I think, if I were to go back and rewrite parts of Righteous Rhetoric, I might even make that amendment to it. I might make that point stronger, that the reason why CWA and groups like it are able to colonize the American imagination is in great part because so many of us had our imaginations colonized from the very beginning by evangelical frames. Yeah.
By birth.
Right. So perspectives on sex are huge. Perspectives on individualism and individual liberties are huge. This idea that I should be able to do precisely what I want without being answerable to anyone else. Right. This extremely high respect for religion, with religion defined in explicitly conservative Christian ways, right? So there are some things that almost all Americans will tell you that regardless of their own affiliations or sympathies, you will find resonance with evangelical ideas. I explore that at length in this second book. But in Righteous Rhetoric, one of the things that I point out there is that the reason why, these symbols work, the reason why CWA does not come off as some wacky fringe group to a lot of people is because this is how we've all been trained to think.
Right.
Even if we don't realize it. So one of the best examples of that, I think, is, and I don't remember which book I mentioned it in, but, the fact that a lot of LGBTQ rights organizations today still attempt to appeal to some of the structures of Christianity to prove their legitimacy. Well, you don't have to, there are passages, in, the book of Psalms that refer to this. And then, there's the story of this that shows us that, all God cares about is love. And then there's this other story over here that's simply been misinterpreted. And really it's about, but this need to appeal to the Bible as your source of authenticity and thus your source of social worth, right?
Right.
Is already a symptom of having your imagination colonized by this evangelical sort of thinking.
Right. It shows where the Overton window is of that discussion.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Right. Totally. So
that's where our imaginations are framed from the start.
Right. So, so to circle it, sorry, I rambled there. To circle the wagons.
Right.
Yes, this is, I think it's really important to say that this is why that sort of rhetoric works really, really well. By groups like CWA. So at the very end of the book, I make the point that it's not an unusual type of rhetoric, right? Tons of groups use it. And as we mentioned earlier, they would be stupid not to, just in terms of bang for your buck. But I try to point out that from my perspective, at least, Christian right groups use it particularly well. And the reason why they use it well is because, again, they have sort of this moral there's the perception of moral authority, and so they often get attention just from folks that are much more likely to believe kind of a traditional Christian narrative about both society and the nation.
Right.
But
that's a cultural wealth. Yeah.
Right. Because they have political and financial support that makes the dissemination of that message and the connection back to to their platforms relatively accessible. But also because it's not a hard message to buy if you are already inclined to believe some of the basic structures into which they buy. So this is what I meant earlier about colonizing the imagination. Here's an example. So if my daughter says to me, I think I want to become a prostitute when I grow up, right? My answer to that is probably, like hell you are, right?
Right.
Now, believe me, I am fully aware of all of the reasons why prostitution happens.
Yes.
That we know that the majority of, or not necessarily majority, but a large proportion of prostitution is an act of desperation. This is not something that happens because many women want it to happen. I'm not trying to gloss over that at all. But we also do know that there are women and men who are sex workers who enjoy this career, and for them it is a chosen career, right? And they do it knowingly, and they are aware of the risks, they are aware of the benefits, and some simply choose this. So if my daughter were to come to me and to say this, if she were one of those who for whom this was a choice made with full agency, even though I could, I've got lots of knowledge at my disposal regarding, why sex is an act that is not really fundamentally different than a lot of other acts we do with our bodies. And even though I could talk about kind of the pros and cons of that particular choice, and even though I could, just from a bare bones ethics perspective, I could identify a lot of other career paths that are far more socially acceptable that from, again, a basic ethics perspective, do a lot more social harm, right? There's no part of me that's probably going to be comfortable with her as a prostitute. Now,
of course, that's just from the perspective of all the possible realm. I think about a lot of career choices that my son could make that I would be uncomfortable with,
Sure.
just from my background, my history.
Yeah,
you know,
right,
if he
right.
wanted to, and if he wanted to play for the NFL, I'd say like hell you are, because
right,
I don't want his brain to get smashed in.
Yeah, no,
Right.
I feel the same
Exactly.
way, right?
Yeah.
But playing for the NFL would bring him a level of prestige.
But that would be culturally a different place.
It would be culturally
yes.
different place, right? So I point this out because I might, as a scholar who studies sex stuff, right, I can cognitively recognize all of the different ways in which a career in sex work, if one freely chosen, one enjoyed by the person, one that is fulfilling, one that provides benefits to many people,
Right.
I can fully recognize that that might be a perfectly ethical choice if we understand. And I don't want to railroad
Right.
the conversation.
This could trail off really easily. Yeah.
Yeah, but I can recognize. I guess what I'm trying to say is that it would be difficult to find a lot of overt harms. Let's put it that way. Except for offended people. And
Right.
offended people is not a harm, by the way. That's you're always going to find those guys, the offended people.
Yeah. Always there.
Right, always present. But
Always in the comments.
what is different, right? What is different is that the emotional baggage that you have, that I have, that most people have about that sort of thing, about sex work, is something that it comes from somewhere, right? These are not random biases we have for no reason. You know, we can historically trace where these things come from. So did you want me to comment on CWA and the feminism thing? You had brought that up at one point, and I didn't really.
Right. Even so, you spend a decent chunk of your book sort of looking at their core principles and how they use this chaos rhetoric to exemplify it. So yeah, if you want to go in a little bit more, kind of speaking to maybe how. Let me just transition to this. Mm-hmm. So you write about a pervasively negative connotation with the term feminism as a fruit of CWA's labor, basically. So, you know, I can attest to this being brought up in a conservative Christian context. Mm-hmm. Attending a conservative Christian undergrad with its ecosystem of conservative values. I'm struck by how certain terms and concepts pervade kind of a distinct space in my instinct.
Right.
Even as my politics have changed over the years. So I'm, you know, light years away from where I was when I say I was 14.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Thank God for that. But it was a major sort of re-educational process when I explicitly acknowledged
mm-hmm.
what my own attitudes and ideals were towards feminism.
Mm-hmm.
But the permeation of how CWA sort of realized they could sort of provoke what we've already talked about was really effective. So maybe if you could speak to how that happens.
Yeah.
And you kind of did.
Yeah. So CWA began when Beverly LaHaye, as she tells the story, right? When she became enraged at watching feminists on TV speak for American women. So the movement began in some ways as a reaction to mainstream feminism. And as you chart the rhetoric of the organization across time, you'll find what appears to be a fairly consistent anti-feminist sort of rhetoric. And there's a whole chapter in the book that's about that, where I try to show that, you know, that the way that CWA discusses this is that there are true women and fake women. And obviously CWA, those are true women, and you know, right. Feminists are fake women. And, you know, they're not real women because they're not supporting other women in their destiny of motherhood and marriage and things like this. Now,
just trying to messing it all up.
Now, of course, what is terribly ironic, and this is one of the functions of chaos rhetoric, is that there have been very few mainstream feminists who have argued that getting married and having kids is bad. Almost all of those speakers have, in fact, said that those should simply be choices. I want to point that out because as you look at how CWA's rhetoric on feminism changes over time, and this is something I do address in the book, by the time that we get to the early 2000s, CWA is beginning to actually sound like mainstream feminists. And so they're beginning to publish stories that say every woman should be able to choose whether she marries or becomes a mother. Yes, right? So how can you construe this as somehow anti-feminist? But again, that's sort of the point of chaos rhetoric, is that if it's really critical now that a movement must change the way that it speaks in order to meet the culture where it is, right? From a sociological perspective, you have to adapt to the culture or you will die, right, as a social group. If that's going to happen, then the way that that's got to happen is if you construe your ideological enemy as something that they are not, first of all, right? So in this reading, then, mainstream feminists become, man-hating, children-killing, whatevers.
Right. Baby eating, yeah.
Right, exactly. And then CWA's version of true women become the reasonable, rational women who think all women should choose this, and that's where we get this really interesting substitution of a CWA feminist for a mainstream feminist. So a little bit later on, just right after the turn of the 21st century, right. There's some new rhetoric that pops up. And in this newer rhetoric, CWA actually embraces the term feminism at one point. I have not dug into the annals of the website since finishing that book to see if there are little tidbits where that word is still embraced. But I do want to share with you something that I ran into a few weeks ago that gives me the indication that at least the spirit of that idea is. So in 2003, 2004, CWA is publishing some stories where they're having, I think at this point, we're talking about maybe some of their interns are writing stories and some of their, they have kind of a youth college force that sometimes does some of that work. But they're writing stories about how the true feminists of the U.S. were what we would call the first wave feminists. So these were the people, the women who in the early 20th century were fighting,
suffrage.
Yeah, suffrage, but they're also fighting against alcohol, and they're also trying to get, right. They're trying to get education for women and all of these classic things. That we often associate with, seventh grade history, right?
Right.
And so, Carrie Nation and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and all of these names, from the late 19th, early 20th centuries get drummed up and put together. These names that many people don't actually even, unless they really paid attention,
unless they're reading straight out of the history book.
Right. They don't really know what that person was, but they just know woman writes old good, right? Those are the only associations that they make.
Boiled down really well.
Right. Right. 4 words will do it. So that was the tone of some of these pieces coming out. And I mentioned, in fact, that one of those particular pieces in the book that the argument is explicitly made. The early 20th century feminists were the real ones. Then we have the fake feminists who show up in the 60s and 70s, and they hate men and they hate children and they don't want equality. They want, women to dominate everyone else.
Yeah.
And here we are, CWA, attempting to right the imbalance. Mm-hmm. And we fundamentally care about and want to protect women, and we're rallying for women's rights in a way that the fake feminists did not do appropriately, but we, CWA, are restoring the early 20th century's legacy, and we're allowing it to live on today. So it's
revising history in a way to look like you are the true original. And so by doing that, they're able to sort of make these arguments of conservative feminism.
Right. So on their website quite recently, in fact, it might still be there. I didn't check it today, but it very well could be there today. There were all sorts of articles about the Violence Against Women Act and also about the Equality Act. Both of these are recent pieces of legislation intended to, obviously in the case of the Violence Against Women Act, to ensure that women are not abused, murdered. And there are a number of different planks that are built into that have to do everything with laws and guns and a variety of things. And then the Equality Act is kind of an addendum to the Civil Rights, or it's intended to be an addendum to the Civil Rights Act. And it is to sort of inculcate into that a statement, kind of like what the ERA was intended to do, to say that it's illegal to discriminate based on gender, sex, gender identity, sexual orientation.
Right. Establish a basis for equal wages.
Right. Yeah. So CWA's argument has been this. You must call your politician to vote against the Violence Against Women Act, and you must call your politician to vote against the Equality Act, because both of these aren't really about women. They are about giving protections to trans people, and particularly to trans women. And we all know that trans women are really men who are looking for a free ride. And so if your politician votes for these things, then we will have fake women hurting real women. So
I mean, that takes it to a whole new level then.
Totally,
that's like, right.
So
like it's every sense of the word, you know, if you're trying to paint that imagination of not us. You know.
Right. Yeah.
There
so
you go.
this is to me, you know, and I'm glad we're talking at this point in time about this, because Righteous Rhetoric was now published 5 years ago, and the political landscape has substantially changed since then.
I think that's safe to say. Yeah.
And it's now also given us a little time to step back and look at how this type of talk continues to be produced by this and various other groups.
Yeah. And
whereas there was, you know, obviously CWA would never say we really want women to be abused and murdered. You know, obviously no one wants this, right?
Sure.
But the way that it is presently positioning itself as a force to protect women from predatory trans women, and they would simply call these men, right?
Right.
Seeing themselves as, you know, protecting women against predators.
Mm-hmm.
And being the advocate for gender justice. That is absolutely part of the rhetoric right now. And again, this is how it works, is if it's dangerous for you to define your own position too rigidly, right? Mm-hmm. Because then you're going to be in a hole somewhere along the way later. Right. It is always safest for you to find a new enemy and to readjust and realign, find a new enemy, readjust and realign. And so that's what we see happening.
So that's some of the ubiquity that you're talking about chaos rhetoric, about how it can mean all things to all people, and it can adjust and sort of morph into the next enemy.
Oh yeah.
But it is enemy oriented. And, you know, I think specifically, I guess, in this context of the men who are standing outside of the Target bathrooms and saying, I'm going to go into the women's room and protect my little girl, right. You know, from some a subgroup of people that he's likely never met and definitely doesn't understand.
Right.
But this perception has been created, and this emergency of an enemy invasion, you know, and exists. And so there's that sort of like, people take it to that extreme, you know, like it might be reflected in attitudes, but some people actually do act on that and march into the bathrooms to defend you know, whatever's going on in there.
You know, I think that's one thing that we have seen particularly. I mean, if you look at the rise in hate groups and hate acts and, you know, all sorts of different, much more obvious, demonstrative acts of prejudice, hate, violence, you know, since the election of Donald Trump. I mean, I think we're seeing that take place, right?
Yeah.
I'm not saying, obviously, that you know, that we were living in some sort of paradise prior to that, but...
No. Statistically speaking, there are more instances of hate crimes and violence against people of color. That's just there.
It's just the numbers, as they say. Right.
So are you tracking with CWA's post 2016 influence a lot? Are you running into that with your new book or sort of?
Well, so I don't specifically focus on CWA in the new book, but there are things that overlap a lot. That I didn't, I mean, I knew, I don't know, it's not like I blocked this first book out or anything, but there are some similar themes. So here's an example. So the new book is also about rhetoric. The new book is also about evangelicals. Although much more, as I said, broadly defined. I think about evangelicalism here as a way of talking rather than as a group.
Sure. Yeah. Which is what you're in the realm of communication.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So that makes sense.
And I'm also talking in this new book about conceptions of American nationalism, which ties really closely into a lot of the work that CWA does. So I don't mention them by name, but I do. I'm continuing with the same line of thought that I began with the first one. I started thinking about this book several years ago, actually not long after I finished Righteous Rhetoric, because I was just completely stymied by the fact that Americans could, first of all, get so worked up over political sex scandals. I mean, that there just could be so much time and energy and perseveration. In a lot of cultures, sex scandals are much less likely to happen, in part because the culture just at large doesn't care as much about the personal life of the politician.
Yeah, I remember being aware of like sex scandals happening in France and it being totally not a big deal.
Right.
And this was like after Clinton years.
Right, exactly.
Right.
So I was intrigued by that on the one hand. I think additionally, another thing that sparked my intrigue there was the degree to which in a sex scandal, politicians tend to pull out all the religious speech. And the degree to which they rhetorically attempt to jump certain political hurdles that they anticipate are coming in the future. And so we're back again to family talk and, sin and forgiveness talk and, about, what makes America a great nation. It's all the same sort of soup.
Right.
You're just eating it in a different restaurant, soup. Right? So
yeah, definitely.
So that was of interest too. And then when Donald Trump became a presidential candidate was where I felt compelled to start writing. Because it was at first I was like many Americans where I was like, oh, surely not. Surely this is not happening.
The denial phase.
Right.
Yes.
Sure. Well, but even I think I even remember thinking he's clearly had too many affairs. That will come up somewhere. He will be, he'll be forced to resign along the way, and this is just how it will be. So I did not anticipate at that time that so many conservative Americans in particular would so warmly accept someone who, let me tell you a poll because I'm talking around this. So one of the statistics that I mentioned in the book is that during the Obama administration, a group of conservative Republicans were asked about their tolerance for a politician who was guilty of some sort of illicit affair. And only since, and I don't remember the numbers exactly off the top of my head, but it was something like 30% of Republicans were like, that would be appropriate. If this person's a really great leader and, they are really committed to making, America a better place to be, and they really followed the party line on this, only 30% of Republicans said they could get behind that, right?
Yeah, then that will be acceptable.
Right. So they rerun the poll after Trump is elected, and the number jumps to like 70% or something substantial. It's more than double, right?
Right.
And so I have long been really interested in what makes people, for lack of a better term, hypocritical. I hesitate to use the word hypocritical because it makes it sound as if only some people are, when in fact all people are.
Sure.
So maybe I should say I have a longstanding interest in what makes people inconsistent. And so that's one of the basic things that you have to accept when you're going to study humans, is that they really suck at consistency. I mean, they're real bad at it.
Right.
So I wanted to understand this phenomenon of political sex scandals and the public's response. I had a sense that it was connected in some degree to this evangelical narrative that so many of us, again, have up and working in our brains about what is appropriate sex, gender, reproductive, templates or lives through which we might live. And I was also just kind of really interested in the way that people handled their own inconsistencies. How do you say that you're a family values person and then vote for a person who stands against everything you say you believe. Now I am not, by the way, I want to be super clear. I'm not arguing one way or the other that a politician's sex life should be a part of political conversation. I'm not
right. That's not the focus.
No.
Right.
And I don't express my opinion on that in the book either. What I am interested by is in thinking more thoroughly about how people can tolerate what are at many points glaring inconsistencies regarding politicians and their sex lives, and why they can care so deeply about, again, a person they've never met, their private life, and what really should be, I mean, if we're all being honest, what should probably be a private conversation between a politician and their spouse, in this particular case.
Right.
So that led to compromising positions. And at first I thought that I was going to write a book about all the ways in which the evangelical narrative of forgiveness and redemption had saved some politicians and had like crash landed with others. And then the more that I got into it, I realized that I had to write a different book because the data just didn't necessarily support that. And what I discovered, which dovetails totally with the political scene today, what I discovered is that amongst male politicians who are guilty of some sort of sexual indiscretion, and by the way, I studied only male politicians because A, there's a lot more of them.
Yes.
And B, you have a very, very small number of female politicians who've been caught in sex scandals at all. And there's literally not enough to make any sort of representative sample. So
there might be a story. I don't even know.
Yeah,
like I can't draw one out of memory.
It's like a handful. It really is. It's really not enough to make a statistically significant proportion to discuss. So what I wanted to do was to examine why some politicians perish and why some don't. Like why do you have Donald Trumps, and then why do you have a bunch of other guys who don't make it?
Right.
And the thumbnail sketch is that I discovered that the more that a politician ascribes to a hyper-masculine set of motifs, the more that a politician comes off as aggressive, an aggressive white American man, the more that a politician comes across as red-blooded, perhaps borderline violent, the more that a politician engages in anti-immigrant talk. Basically, the more that a politician comes off as this hyper-masculine hetero white guy, the more likely he is to be able to have a political career after a sex scandal.
To get away with it, yeah. Yeah,
basically. Now, this is borne out in an unfortunate little tidbit that's totally TMI, but I will now share it because it's critical. Politicians who engage in sex acts that are virtual or that are not procreative, let's say. So Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky never engaged in penile vaginal sex.
Right.
They did lots of things with cigars, but that, or we think about the number of a number of politicians who I mention in the book were found guilty of sexting, right? So we can think of Anthony Weiner, we can think of Mark Foley.
Weiner, yeah.
Okay. Usually, a politician who has engaged in some sort of physical sex act. I mean, sexting is usually the end of your career because it's seen as not super masculine, right? I mean, you didn't actually do the deed. It's just like fake sex.
Yeah, couldn't even,
Exactly, right. And so there is, and it's not true in all cases, but there is an interesting sort of correlation between men who engage in physical sex acts with women, and particularly if they are, again, like penile, vaginal, penetrative, if they are procreative, where they tend to be seen as more manly, and thus they tend to survive better than if the sex act in question was virtual.
Which is fascinating to me because it really...
I know.
Yeah. So you could almost write a book about that.
Yeah, and I did.
And thank God.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So it gives you sort of a blueprint then to look at how because it's the total constant obsession, I would say, with, at least initially with the media, is how is this happening? And, there was a Medium article after Medium article or Vox or whatever about this is why Trump happened. And, this is why he's different. And it's almost a completely different theory each time.
Right.
But that's because it's just so hard to define, because we're not stepping back far enough to look at the picture. We're just looking, and I always sort of think of Trump as the symptom, and a lot of people do, as the symptom of something, more cultural, and more historical. So looking at it from that lens of what is the acceptable norm, and what role does masculinity and hypermasculinity play, and whether we can approve of something or shame something. And looking weak is not going to get you very far. I think of, this is why I think Trump is as grotesque as I find him. Looking at him on the stage with all those other Republican primary candidates, he so masterfully was able to just trash them in a political sense, because he knew how to make them all look weak.
Right.
Kind of from what you're talking about. So he pointed out, little Marco, or or sleepy Ben Carson, or Jeb, poor little Jeb. His mother doesn't even like him. Low energy Jeb.
Right.
And that's what that made me think of as you're describing that.
Right. So, he functions rhetorically. And here's the thing is we all know that he's not a great speaker. He does not use words that in a way that display any sort of finesse or nuance. That no one disputes this.
He has the best words. Yeah.
Right. He uses only a few of the words, and not always in the most beautiful way. But what he does do in a very masterful way, and I'm not even sure it's intentional, but it's working, is that he makes a large proportion of Americans feel like that when he's in charge, their nation is great. And one of the things that I discuss in the book is that those candidates, again, who tend to survive these scandals tend to be white, male, wealthy, powerful. This is true. But it's not so much that, because the people who also perish also tend to be those things. The ones who survive are those who, by and large, are able to talk about America as a place that is white, that is straight, that is strong, and who are able to sort of back that up with their own, white heteromasculine appeal. And so in most of the chapters throughout this book, I contrast a politician who survived and a politician who didn't, right? And one of my favorite chapters is the one comparing Anthony Weiner with Arnold Schwarzenegger. And, Anthony Weiner, particularly in the media, the way that he was humiliated, and remember that as far as we know, that the sex acts in which he was engaged were all virtual. But his decline was swift. And Arnold Schwarzenegger admitted days before the California, governor's election that he was in fact guilty of physically assaulting, sexually assaulting a certain number of women. He's written, he's been interviewed extensively about his sexual practices. And you would have to be an absolute moron to believe that Arnold Schwarzenegger was not engaging in any sort of illicit sex. At the very least, because he admits he was. Right? Because
he told you.
He tells us, right?
Right.
Donald Trump, I don't know if you've ever read Donald Trump's business books. I happen to have done so for this book.
I've not had the privilege yet.
Yeah, Donald Trump talks in some of his books about his affairs. And, it is not a secret. So
closely related to my business practices.
Exactly. Right. And that's the way that he construes it, is that he is so popular and well-known and so much an icon for so many people in the world that he can have, whatever woman he wants.
It's part of the brand.
Part of the brand. Right.
So I guess, and I want to be respectful of your time here. So I guess that sort of brings us, just to tie that line, just to draw that line between points here, as we summarize, the Reagan moral majority. We have the, you talk about the Clinton years and some ways in which, and the point can easily be made of when the election saw some reaction sort of against that, but then also some of the policies that I think that the like welfare reform, for one, during the Clinton years were a continuation of this this whole thing. Kind of that welfare queen mentality. And we have the Bush years and Obama reaction. So it's kind of a back and forth thing culturally, which brings us to today with the Trump administration. And it flows fairly easily, I think, as we look at the utilization of the same strategies and the same use of rhetoric coming from many sources and synchronizing between cultural groups and the messaging of the administration. What are some examples of chaos rhetoric as far as some of the policies that you've seen? I think of the immigration. I've talked a lot about the immigration issue on this podcast.
One of the things that I think it's important to remember about chaos rhetoric is that while anyone can use it, not everybody uses equally good facts when they do. Mm-hmm. And I point that out in the book, but I feel compelled to point it out again, because just because you're saying that two very different groups utilize the same rhetorical tactic does not mean that the facts behind the rhetorical tactic are equally verifiable, right? Are equally valid. Right. So, probably the one of the most obvious examples of this in the Trump administration is starting to talk about Mexicans in particular as bad hombres, right? Mm-hmm. The insistent conversation about immigrants as a sort of, again, like a predatory people who are attempting to violate laws. This while Trump is actively attempting to violate asylum-related laws, right? It's completely though emotionally easy. If you believe that there, is a group, you're the average Trump supporter, and you believe that there is a group of people about to beat down the door to your house. I don't know.
Right. Someone in Kansas is thinking that the caravan is coming for their front door.
Right.
Yeah.
And let's be honest, there are some places where a caravan could go. I don't want to diminish that.
Could go somewhere, sure, right. Yeah.
They end up somewhere. But this notion that Americans are constantly on the edge of some sort of peril is a theme that is so old, it is as old as the country itself. One of my favorite books, it's an older book now. I can't remember the author off the top of my head, but it's called Hellfire Nation. I'm going to look that up because that's going to drive me nuts. But the whole reason why it's an interesting book is because this particular historian makes the argument that, as I was mentioning earlier, James Morone.
James Morone.
Yeah,
Hellfire Nation.
Hellfire Nation. Morone. Let's see. That name just came to me. Let's see if I'm right. Yeah, I am. Woohoo. Look, James Morone.
There it is. Well, Morone, all right.
Anyway.
Yeah, we got it.
Now, I as a person who is not an historian, I don't want to say that I can completely validate. I didn't look at his historiography,
sure.
Right? So I'm not necessarily saying this is the end all be all book. But one of the things that I really liked about that book was that when I was writing my dissertation, I first happened upon it, and he lays out how in every generation, or every major shift also kind of in American culture, there has been an uprising typically of conservatives who voice some concern about a social change that's going on and who construe it as something that is potentially catastrophic to the survival of the nation. And if you were to count all the times, according to Morone, that the nation has almost failed, It's every single day, right? And so what I really enjoy about this historical examination is that it really helps us to contextualize the rhetoric that we're seeing today. And I think it's very, very difficult to say that what we're seeing today and what Marone is talking about, these are almost always about issues of gender, race, and ethnicity. Mm-hmm. Almost always. They also frequently are about issues of class. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about issues of gender, race, and ethnicity, those are sometimes easier visibly to see, right? It's visibly easier to see someone who you know, if they have a skin color that differs from yours, or if you know, their body is different than yours, then it's a little easier to peg them with certain stereotypes. But a lot of times, you know, when we talk about class and when we talk about poverty, that's a masked way to talk about race.
Right.
And so one of the things that he points out is that the U.S. has never not been engaging in these hell in a handbasket narratives without at the same time seeing those narratives as ones that are fundamentally about gender, race, class, what have you.
We've always looked at it that way.
Yeah, right. Right. So it may appear that this conversation about immigration is rooted in a new series of political issues. So when Trump recently said that immigrants can't come here because we're full, right? Now, obviously he didn't elaborate on what that meant, but one would believe that that means that there is literally no room for people.
Yeah. No, Grand Canyon's full. Yeah. Every people.
All the hollowed out places are full.
Literal sea of humanity.
Right. But as we know, across the U.S., there are many places that are actually, because of a number of factors, that are actually kind of hurting for people and hurting for workers. And there are lots of places that have stood up and said, oh, but we're not full. And we also know, and this is something that, I don't know how many Americans actually kind of recognize this, but, you know, that there are entire industries on which the nation's economy depends that are funded, or not that are funded, but that are driven strongly by immigrant labor. Right. Agriculture is a great example, right?
Agriculture, yeah, extremely.
Lots and lots of food processing. We're talking about, you know, if we really were to erase immigrants, and in some cases illegal immigrants, from the American landscape, those of us who are citizens would be living a much different reality, and in most ways it would be far. In fact, I can't think of a way that it would be better, but in many ways it would be far, far worse.
Well, I mean, there'd be this massive adjustment. I mean, you talk about class, and you talk about the term exploitation. Yeah. And exploited labor is how we get we got a lot of wealth in this country, and it's how the wealth has continued to be generated. So in that sense, without that, there'd be a radical readjustment of our economy.
Well, and I'm even thinking about this stuff, you know, ethics aside, and again, we could go down that forever, but most Americans don't like to pay more for stuff. And if you have an entire huge sector of your economy that works only because people are being paid far, far below a living wage, and if suddenly that disappears, then, you know, that most Americans will feel it in their pocketbooks, and that's a way to make people pay attention, sadly. So I see the use of chaos rhetoric in the general demonization of immigrants. Trump is really great at talking about Democrats in general using chaos rhetoric. You know, this back to immigrants, but, you know, talking about how Democrats want open borders. I've never actually run into no one has ever said that. But again, if you can exaggerate the truth, if you can heighten the fear, and if you can sort of constantly shift the target, then you can keep talking and usually keep the good time going, politically speaking, until you reach certain goals.
Keep the post on the enemy at hand.
Right.
Right. And then seeing that, we see that through the painting of immigrants as, you know, we have a new welfare queen, essentially. Right. And it's the immigrant that simultaneously takes, you know, I forget what the meme is, but it's the immigrant that takes your job, but is also too lazy. to work.
Right, exactly.
Schrodinger's immigrant, I think.
Right.
And then we have perceptions of how they're getting all these freebies, you know, all of what's left of our welfare state, and they're just getting it. And when actually they're paying for yours and mine retirement without getting anything back if they're, you know, working these jobs that we're talking about. But the same sort of rhetorical devices are being used, and it's so heavily steeped in rhetoric that it's hard to have a conversation with someone. And I've noticed this, of starting from the same place and defining our terms the same way. That's instantly where I try to go now when it comes to a immigration debate with someone that we're having a disagreement on, because we're talking, especially if you're taking some of this rhetoric as sort of face value, then it's really, we're talking about two different realities. So it makes it incredibly difficult. So I've been very unsuccessful in my conversations because of that. And maybe I just don't understand sort of how to highlight what the rhetoric is. And that's part of why I wanted to have you on the show too. And why I wanted to talk with you is because there needs to be more of an awareness of just from the 30,000 foot level, what's going on here. And so I guess just sort of as we wrap up again, what are the insights you hope that readers gain from an awareness of this concept of chaos rhetoric?
Well, I know that we live in contentious political times, obviously, but we've done that before. And so I think it is a mistake to think that what's happening culturally is unique. I think it's a mistake to think that it is unprecedented. There might be some aspects of it that are unusual in the sense that, you know, the internet did not exist until recently. And as you know, the 24-hour news cycle did not exist until recently. Right. So our exposure is different in some important ways. But this is just part and parcel of how political contests work. I think that's really what I want the reader to know most of all. And I don't necessarily even mean political in the governmental way. I mean political in the power relationship way. And if you want to understand, and this is something that I feel like I say all the time, but it's really quite true. If you want to understand one of the basic ways that power dynamics tend to emerge, is that groups that are in power will almost always interpret the equality of a less powerful group as some sort of oppression.
Right. And
so even though, let's say, you know, if men occupy this level of power, I don't know, this hand is power, okay? And if women are beginning to, through legal and social and cultural shifts, are beginning to experience a sort of power that begins to reflect something close to what men experience, then the people who exist here will almost always interpret another group's rise in power as some sort of threat. Now, of course, it's not a zero-sum game. This group and this group can both experience power, and no one has to lose it. But that's not the way that human social systems tend to work. I mean, they tend to pit themselves against each other. So I think the most important thing I would like the reader to recognize is that powerful groups will almost always interpret less powerful groups as some sort of existential threat and as provoking, again, some sort of predatory, I don't even know how to put it. I think existential threat probably says it best. Some sort of predatory negative relationship is about to emerge. The country's about to die. Families are going to be forced to, whatever it is. It is ironic that those in power often begin to perpetrate the very things that they warn about themselves.
Because that's not what it's about.
Right. So once you can see those patterns happening, then it becomes a little bit easier to be able to ask about facts. And it becomes a little easier to see the social jobs or the social tasks that are happening and going on. And once you can see that, I think you're able to see a little bit clearer what dynamics really do dot the landscape rather than getting lost in the echo chamber that is social media.
Right. And yeah, no, that is sort of the threat, that the perceived threat that's going on there of a podcaster I enjoyed, Sam Cedar makes this point sometimes, that you see when you grow up watching TV and you see people representing yourself who look like you, who are all these sitcoms are relatable experiences to you specifically. Just and your sort of your skin color, they look like me, they kind of talk like me, or, you know, there's some relatable factor. As you see that changing, there is this this sense of threat that people see, you know, and you get visceral responses and reactions to that of some kind of changing cultural norm. And that that response can be really powerful, especially if it's you have organizations like CWA or like Fox News or the intellectual dark web, and play on that and exploit that and pull that out, and they find out which button to press when it comes to your reaction to that natural occurrence of, hey, I have less privilege than I did before, even if it's just a slight amount. That's enough to create the visceral response. And so our increased awareness of this might help you a little bit in that transition to appreciate that, no, actually you're not losing anything, even though there's you know, like you grew up in evangelical conservative church and you talked about how gay marriage is going to destroy your family somehow specifically. But when all actuality, nothing changes for you. There's just a gay couple on TV now. Right. And but they might not be white.
The privilege, right? What you said earlier.
But it changes. Right. But
nothing, but that's not usually, you know, no one gets on, you know, a podcast and says, I'm losing my privilege, help, right? That's usually not the
well, I mentioned the IDW. That's almost the Jordan Peterson. I feel like we're almost, there's like a whole new industry burgeoning there. But I'll go ahead and cut it off there. But there's obviously different avenues we could keep exploring with that. But I really appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, you bet.
After
pleasure.
Recovering from your India bug that you seem to have extracted.
But I never want to interact with it again. I think it's fair.
Right. Yeah. the knowledge isn't needed so much as the never having it again part.
Exactly. I've been telling people that, like, the 2 or 3 good things that came from that trip was that I got a cool pair of pants, I made a speech I had to make, and I have, you know, proven that I can get really sick in another country and survive. So 3 good things.
Right. You're building resilience for the future. As a therapist, I love to hear that.
Yeah, thank you. Good. I'm glad I said all the things right.
You did say all the things right, which, right. So again, thank you so much. And I'd love to have you back on in the future. There's plenty of rhetoric going around. So a lot to be made aware of. Leslie Dorrough Smith, the book we talked about, Righteous Rhetoric, and let's see the sub. We can just get a screen of it.
Oh yeah,
I know you have that there. Yes. Okay. So if you're watching, and this is actually the first episode I'm maybe streaming on YouTube Live, so we'll see if that pans out.
Sex, Speech, and the Politics of Concerned Women for America. That's that one. Yep.
That's that one. And your new book?
Compromising Positions, I'm going to try it again, Sex Scandals, Politics, and American Christianity. I think that's right.
There it is. And you can find that where?
Oh, it'll be out in November, hopefully, with Oxford University Press.
Okay. Terrific. Leslie, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks.
All right.
Bye-bye. Again, that was Leslie Dorrough Smith, and this has been a episode of Off Baseline, first in a while. So I appreciate you
tuning in. And like I said, this is the first YouTube live episode. So let me know feedback, provide comments, send me a message on social media. Let me know how that was received. And if we need to make any adjustments, we will do that. So thanks so much for listening, and find us, subscribe on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, whatever it's called these days, Google Play, etc. Offbaseline.com has all the links. You can find Off Baseline on Twitter as well. And I'm Nate Staley. Thanks for tuning in, and be well.
Going underground.